Hi everybody, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. This is going to be my July Marginalia video. So the video I make where I discuss any poems, plays, short stories, whole books, essays, whatever I read in the past month that I didn't do any videos about. This month's musical recommendations at the end will all come from the great Fear Street trilogy that was on Netflix in July, and something my wife and I both really enjoyed. So let's jump in. We'll kick off with some poets. So first up, the great Fernando Pessoa. I didn't even know this volume existed when the month of July started, but I saw it on Matthew at Bottle and Books highlighting it. So this became, got a copy online, and this was really fun to be reading in. We read from the very first section the Alberto Cairo poems, which are interesting. They're very in tune with nature. They feel akin to the high romantics, and maybe even Algernon Swinburne to a certain extent, those types of poets who are fascinated by nature, fascinated by this idea of returning to nature, following your feelings, and examining those things. Although I did also dive in and read one poem from the Alvaro de Campos section, the famous Maritime Ode. But this is a real joy. I also was reading from my Penguin Book of Modern African Poetry. I read a number of absolutely outstanding poets this month. A couple that I want to highlight, but a couple that I read. Antoine-Roger Bolamba, Mukula Kadima-Nzuji, both from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And then from Senegal, I read from David Diop. And I'd like to read one of his poems because I thought they were just great. So this is The Vultures. In those days, when civilization kicked us in the face, when holy water slapped our cringing brows, the vultures built in the shadow of their talons, the blood-stained monument of tutelage. In those days, there was painful laughter on the metallic hell of the roads, and the monotonous rhythm of the paternoster drowned the howling on the plantations. Oh, the bitter memories of extorted kisses, of promises broken at the point of a gun, of foreigners who did not seem human, who knew all the books but did not know love. But we whose hands fertilized the womb of the earth, in spite of your songs of pride, in spite of the desolate villages of torn Africa, hope was preserved in us as in a fortress. And from the mines of Swaziland to the factories of Europe, spring will be reborn under our bright steps. And I had been reading, that's an outstanding poem, and that is one of a number of poems from Diop that are in this volume, and I was astonished, but I'm really excited. I have his copy of his At Night All Blood is Black, and I'm looking forward to reading that sometime in the next 5 or 6 weeks. And then from Zambia, I have from Gwendoline Konie, In the Fist of Your Hatred. Like a worm I writhe in your tight fist, as you try to smother my voice. In my mind with your brutal grip, fear stalks the house of my brain, as your pepper-red eyes shout blood. Your grip strangles my tongue. Your fingers sprinkle seeds of fear in my mind, and it sprouts like a raging bushfire. You have set up fear as my companion, and I cringe from your bloodshot eyes. Secret alarm bells sear my brain, and leave me burning with a wild rage. For I will not let fear swallow my breath, my dreams, and my hopes. My hidden courage will saw off your fist. And the true just emotion and experience that is lived in through those lyrics and through these poems throughout this volume really make this just a mainstay of, I think, the reading of poetry I have been able to engage in. In the Penguin Book of Spanish Verse, stimulated by sort of exploring modernism in the Spanish language, of course, was reading from Rubén Darío. This is Fatality. Happy the tree that can scarcely feel, and happier the hard stone because it does not feel at all, for there is no greater grief than the grief of being alive, and no greater affliction than conscious life, to be and to know nothing, and to have no fixed course, and the fear of what was, and a terror of the future, and the certain terror of being dead tomorrow, and to suffer for life, and the shadow of death, and for what we do not know and hardly suspect, and for the flesh that tempts with its fresh grapes, and the tomb that waits with its funeral branches, and not to know whither we go or whence we come. And so Darío was an outstanding poet from Nicaragua who sort of kicked off modernism in Central and South America, and just the handful of poems from him in here have certainly whetted my appetite to read more. Many great stories. We'll dive into a few of those now. From the Penguin Book of Japanese Short Stories, I reread In the Box by Tōno Kaeko because I knew that the Codex Cantina was doing their video on it. And so I reread that story, and that is such a strange a beautiful story. I don't want to say it's delightful, but because it really is like critical of humanity. But it's a strange and interesting story. I also was reading more stories from The Decapitated Chicken and Other Stories by Horacio Quiroga, the Uruguayan modernist who stimulated the Darío reading. From him, I read a few more. A Slap in the Face, The Pursued, and The Dead Man. And so these continue to be truly horrifying stories. I did a video on The Decapitated Chicken and on why I thought that was one of the more like terrifying story experiences I've had. From Ray Bradbury, I read The Sound of Thunder, which I feel like there's another short story that takes that idea. And I need to find it, and I can't remember what it was. But that is apparently one of the favorite Bradbury stories from the Codex Cantina. Let's see. From Idogwa Rampo, the Idogwa Rampo reader, I read The Martian Canals, and famously that idea that there was at one time the belief that there were canals on Mars that turned out to just be geological formations. But it deals with someone whose like skin is scarred in such a way that it appears to have Martian canals like drawn on it, which was really quite horrifying. The essays in here though are just as strange and truly uncomfortable. So I read Spectral Voices, which deals with this question of what it's like to like the sense of disembodiment of a voice from the radio in a very unsettling way. This has really been a great book to be dipping in and out of kind of every about 3 weeks, reading a story and an essay from Rampo. I read the title story, Gogol's Wife, by Tommaso Landolfi. I also read some other stories from him that deal with wives. So Giovanni and his wife, and also Pastoral from these. And so I'm thinking about a video on Gogol's Wife. I'm trying to frame my thinking around how I'd want that to be. But that stimulated a question around wanting to read a story by Kathleen Collins. And so this is Whatever Happened to Interracial Love. It's a great, great set of stories. The specific story I was thinking of, and the specific story that I went back and reread, was Exteriors, which is the very first story in the book. It starts Exteriors and then Interiors. And they're short, but it had the same sense of like unsettling, weird feelings around relationships. From Julio Cortázar, I reread really Blow Up. I also read Continuity of Parks, which is a very, very incredible story by Cortázar. It's one that I think really shows just how willing he is to play with ideas in a way that few writers were willing to. And it's a story I'd probably like to do a video on again at some point in the future. I also read a series of essays by Jorge Luis Borges on Cortázar, and those were interesting. They helped inform my thinking. Some great Cthulhu Mythos stories. This will be a little stack here. This great volume, H.P. Lovecraft and Others, Tales of the Cthulhu Mythos, includes Styx by Karl Edward Wagner, which is an amazing story. It influenced the strange stick sculptures that were found in the first season of True Detective. But I also read My Boat by Joanna Russ, who's one of my favorite like underrated science fiction writers. And that's a really, really strange story dealing with this like magical boat. I believe on Long Island, not on Manhattan, but it's on Long Island. From Lord Dunsany, I read, oh my goodness, where is it at? The Bride of the Man Horse? I think that, yeah, Bride of the Man Horse. It was not the strongest Dunsany story I've encountered. From Edgar Allan Poe, The Telltale Heart. I'm a fan of that story. It's pretty crazy, but I am a fan of that story. I don't know if there are other diesel punk fans out here, but when I reread The War of the Worlds, I love diesel. I love steampunk, but diesel punk, the sort of that idea of technology stopping in the roughly 1930 rather than 1910, 1900, is also really interesting. And there's a great story in here, Don Quixote by Carrie Vaughan, which deals with a sort of like super tank weapon during the Spanish Civil War, and the fear that other fascist powers in Europe could discover this one prototype weapon and then mass produce it, and what that would mean. So this is a really Mammoth Book of Diesel Punk. Cool volume. Let's see, from Ernest Hemingway, A Day's Wait. You can wait on A Day's Wait. It's not his strongest. The lovely Arthur Machen, Novel of the White Powder. Machen's willingness to just go to strange places and really try to capture how weird life can be from its natural form, like in nature, and then the idea of life as a corrupting force, and specifically human life as this like corrupting agent potentially, is always really interesting. It's unsettling and not something I want to spend too much time on, but it's interesting. Oops. I also reread Pickman's Model by H.P. Lovecraft, and I think that's an interesting story, the idea that he's found a way to get really close to some strange things that aren't just necessarily visions from his imagination. I read the titular story, The Elephant Vanishes by Haruki Murakami in this short story collection. That was fairly interesting. I think Murakami, it's interesting. I think his stories, he can come up with interesting ideas, and I think the problem is when he has a full novel, he sometimes starts to fill it with, he goes into down roads that either his writing shouldn't be traveling down, or that no one's writing should really be traveling down. But in his stories, I think he's sometimes able to keep it a little more contained, to the betterment of the story. Let's see. I did read a couple of like full books. So one of those was The Open Sore of a Continent by Wool C. Inca, and this was really a series of lectures given in the middle 1990s in the aftermath of a coup in Nigeria to ensure a sort of coup in Nigeria to ensure that the free elections would not actually like be ratified and fulfilled. And so Cinca was sort of in exile and gave a series of 3 lectures, and those are collected in here. And his passion, of course, is there. His insight is there. His experiences from having spent 30 years as part of, opposition government, just being a leading voice is certainly present, and this is well worth reading. Despite being 25 years old, it still resonates today. I read the first section of Simon If stories by Aleister Crowley, The Scrutinies of Simon If. They were interesting. There's certainly Sherlock Holmes, except we see the opium a little bit more. And it really, I should say, it's more Mycroft Holmes than Sherlock Holmes, and we see the opium a little bit more. But they were interesting. I'm going to continue dipping into Simon If, seeing where he takes me, the strange avenues. The very first story involving like a murder and the idea that someone else can create a perfect murder and use the other perfect murderer as a victim was interesting to explore. As part of a fun little post-Euro Cup read-along, we read 3 Men in a Boat by Jerome K. Jerome, and this is a riot. It was really, really fun to read, and just to laugh and enjoy. My wife was into neo-noir in July. We were watching a lot of films, and that meant that I dug out Jim Thompson. I'm not a fan of Jim Thompson, but I picked up a bunch of his books when I was like 25, 22. And so I read Population 1280. Set in Texas in like 1910. It is miserable. If you're participating in Faulkner and August and reading Sanctuary and you're really enjoying it, check this book out, check this writer out. If you don't enjoy wallowing in like the misery of human evil, avoid both Population 1280 and Jim Thompson as far as you can. Brian at Bookish and I finished our read-through of the USA trilogy by John Dos Passos. The Big Money, it was good. The biographies continue to be by far the best part of the trilogy. The newsreels are interesting, though. The camera eyes usually are interesting. The characters themselves, the writing is not up to the same level. And so it's an interesting example of modernism where the style points are very, very high, but the actual like substance narrative points are quite low. I think throughout the full series, but particularly in 1919, and that kind of continued in The Big Money. But I'm glad I read it. I had never read the whole trilogy. I had bailed on it a solid 15 years ago, just stopped a third of the way through 1919 because I didn't like it. But some other cool works. Let's see. We had some more essays. Poetry of Matthew Arnold. And then from the Viking portable romantic poets, Walter Scott. Sir Walter Scott was in our reading. My daughters, of course, love poetry, so we get into a lot of that. Toni Morrison. So I reread Home early in July, and so I read some of her essays that were written like roughly contemporaneously. So Home, The Price of Wealth, and Invisible Ink. Invisible Ink is an outstanding essay. That's one of the better essays I've found on like a writer talking about her own authorial effect, but talking about it through this conscious idea of trying to do something as a writer that she had been exploring as a reader first. And I thought that was really, really interesting. So Invisible Ink is highly recommended. From Diderot, In Praise of Richardson, which did not necessarily convince me to read Samuel Richardson. But Diderot is always great. I did read a single story from the Decameron, Day 5, Story 9, in part because I think it was an influence on Ibsen's Wild Duck, but also I believe an influence on The Decapitated Chicken by Horacio Quiroga. And so I'll link that video in the description box because I do think that influence is very present there. Let's see, some readings from the notebooks of Victor Serge, kind of as preparation for reading The Master and Margarita by Bulgakov later this month. I technically finished this in August, but I was really reading the bulk of the second half of the Romanovs by Simon Sebag Montfier. And this was good. I found fewer issues with like the chronology feeling mixed up in this one. Alexander II, I think I was really interested in the different ways he tried to reform and then also would pull back. He famously freed the serfs, but that didn't necessarily mean what it meant. And then just again reinforcing the idea of how truly incompetent Tsar Nicholas II was, and you know, the denouement of the Romanovs and the murder of the children is truly horrifying. The staggering incompetence of Nicholas just continues to astound me. It's a true tragedy. What happened to his children and so many people during the violent revolutions. But yeah, I started reading from the Viking portable of Carl Jung. This is edited by Joseph Campbell, so it's really, really interesting to see what Campbell pulls from Jung and the ways he focuses on Jung's interest in the common mythologies that Campbell believes unite humanity. So this has been a real joy to be digging into. Let's see, from Modern Irish Drama, I read Crap's Last Tape by Samuel Beckett, and it did not change my opinion on Beckett. I'm still waiting for Godot to be interesting, and I still believe that endgame is the proper strategy with Beckett. Just end the game, don't start it. I do want to read a passage from Inside the Whale by George Orwell, which consists of 3 essays. One on Charles Dickens, one on Boys Weekly like stories, and one on sort of Henry Miller and James Joyce, in which he calls James Joyce an elephantine pedant, which I thought was great. But he also quotes from these Boys Weeklies. So this is an example. This had me rolling. Billy Bunter groaned. A quarter of an hour had elapsed out of the 2 hours that Bunter was booked for extra French. In a quarter of an hour, there were only 15 minutes, but every one of those minutes seemed inordinately long to Bunter. They seemed to crawl by like tired snails. Looking at the clock in classroom number 10, the fat owl could hardly believe that only 15 minutes had passed. It seemed more like 15 hours, if not 15 days. Other fellows were in extra French as well as Bunter. They did not matter. Bunter did. What? What an absolutely terrible, terrible piece. Orwell refers to some of these characters. Bunter, though in his origin he probably owed something to the fat boy in Pickwick, is a real creation. And he goes on, he is not a subject for daydreams. On the other hand, another seeming figure of fun, Gussie, the Honorable Arthur A. D'Arcy, the swell of St. Jim's, is evidently much admired. Like everything else in the Gem and Magnet, Gussie is at least 30 years out of date. He is the nut of the early 20th century, or even the masher of the 90s. By Jove, dear boy, and well, I shall be obliged to give you a fearful thrashing. It's written in this. The monocled idiot who made good on the fields of Mons and Le Cateau and his evident popularity goes to show how deep the snob appeal of this type is. English people are extremely fond of the titled ass, such as Lord Peter Wimsey, who always turns up trumps in the moment of emergency. Here's a letter from one of Gussie's girl admirers. I think you're too hard on Gussie. I wonder he's still in existence the way you treat him. He's my hero. Did you know I write lyrics? How's this? To the tune of Goody Goody. And it starts out, gonna get my gas mask, join the ARP. It's astonishing. And I was laughing extremely hard the night I read that. I continued reading from the selected essays of Ralph Ellison, kind of reading Soyinka, reading some African poets. I was interested in Ellison, who famously did not want to be regarded as an African-American voice, but rather as an American writer. And he didn't want to be regarded as an African-American writer who had opinions on Africa and on the, decolonialization and like the nationalist movements there. And so it's interesting to see him expressing that, but also see him trying to point people who want him to be part of a committee or contribute a piece or speak about something to other writers, who he famously Richard Wright, who he thinks would do that well. And then I finished Parting the Waters back in March and April, but I wanted to read, I'm going to be starting the next volume, The Pillar of Fire. So I reread the end of Parting the Waters, and then I dipped into A Testament of Hope, which has different speeches, sermons, writing, essays from Martin Luther King Jr., and I reread I Have a Dream, because that's kind of how Parting the Waters is closing, and then I'll be following his writings and speeches in here as I read The Pillar of Fire. So this was an outstanding month. My Marginalia was all over the place. I want to make sure I didn't miss anything. I don't think I did. But in terms of musical recommendations, I did enjoy watching Fear Street. I really, really liked it. I was too young to really read those books extensively in the 1990s, but I was definitely a Goosebumps reader. Loved that series. And so I have some songs that were in the soundtrack of Fear Street. First up will be Sweet Jane. I'll include links to both the Cowboy Junkies version, which I have, but also the Velvet Underground version, which was in part 2. Hey from the Pixies, which has an outstanding bass line running through it. And then the great Live Forever by Oasis from their debut album, Definitely Maybe. So this is my July Marginalia. Again, I hope everybody's doing well, and I'll see you later.